The fall of the Aztec Empire was nothing like you were told. The myth that refuses to die. In almost every textbook, documentary, and Hollywood film, the story follows the same arc. In 1519, a small band of daring Spanish conquistadors, led by the cunning Hernán Cortés, lands on the Mexican coast. They march inland, befriend a few native allies, and through a combination of superior weapons, horses, steel swords, and cannons, plus a dash of divine providence, they topple the mighty Aztec Empire. Moctezuma cowers on his golden throne, believing Cortés to be a returning god. He hands over his treasure. The Spaniards slaughter his people, and the age of the Aztecs ends. End of story. Except it is almost entirely wrong. Modern archaeology, ethnohistory, and a careful rereading of both Spanish and indigenous sources have dismantled this narrative piece by piece. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not a conquest in the European sense. It was a complex, messy, and horrifying war of indigenous liberation. One where the Spaniards were little more than catalyst, not the main engine. The Aztecs won more battles than they lost against Cortés. Moctezuma was not a weak-willed fool, but a shrewd politician who outmaneuvered the Spaniards for months. The real secret weapon was not gunpowder or horses, but a pandemic of smallpox that arrived before the Spaniards did. And the final siege of Tenochtitlan was less a military triumph than a prolonged massacre carried out largely by tens of thousands of native warriors from Tlaxcala, Texcoco, and other city-states who hated the Aztecs far more than they ever feared the Spanish. What follows is the true story of the fall of the Aztec Empire. It is a story of staggering violence, political genius, tragic miscalculation, and the relentless, grinding power of disease. It is also a story that forces us to rethink everything we thought we knew about who conquered whom, the empire that didn't exist. To understand how the Aztec Empire fell, we must first understand what it actually was. And here already, the popular narrative begins to crumble. The term Aztec Empire is itself a misleading label. The people we call Aztecs called themselves the Mexica, pronounced Mexica. Their capital was Tenochtitlan, a breathtaking island city built in the middle of Lake Texcoco. With an estimated 200,000 to 250,000 inhabitants in 1519, it was one of the largest cities on earth, larger than Paris, London, or Lisbon. Its aqueducts, floating gardens, chinampas, causeways, and monumental temples stunned even the most jaded Spanish veterans. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a conquistador who later wrote a memoir, confessed that the Spaniards did not know what to say when they first saw the city. It was like something out of a chivalric romance. But the Mexica did not rule a unitary empire like Rome or the Aztec Empire of imagination. They ruled a hegemonic tribute-based network of alliances, threats, and ritualized warfare. In practical terms, the Mexica of Tenochtitlan, together with their two allied city-states of Texcoco and Tlacopan, formed the so-called Triple Alliance. This alliance dominated most of central and southern Mexico. But dominance was not direct rule. Subject city-states, Altepetl, retained their own kings, laws, and gods. They paid tribute, food, cloth, warriors, and captives for sacrifice to Tenochtitlan. In return, the Mexica offered military protection and a place in the ritual political order. This system worked brilliantly for nearly a century, but it bred a deep, seething resentment. Many city-states paid tribute, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. The Mexica were notorious for brutal reprisals. If a province rebelled, the Mexica would march in, burn the city, kill all the nobles, and replace the population with loyal colonists. More importantly, the Mexica's insatiable demand for sacrificial victims turned war into a perpetual enterprise. The so-called flowery wars, Huachiyaoyotl, were ritualized conflicts designed not to conquer territory, but to capture living victims for sacrifice. This kept the Mexica military sharp, but also made them universally loathed. By 1519, the Triple Alliance had created a political map of hatred. The massive Republic of Tlaxcala, just east of Tenochtitlan, had remained independent for decades through sheer military stubbornness. The Kingdom of Texcoco, once a full partner, was now a resentful junior member. The coastal Totonac and Huastec peoples paid heavy tribute and dreamed of rebellion. Everywhere there were cracks. Into this volatile landscape stepped Hernán Cortés, not as a conquering god, but as a lucky opportunist with a talent for exploiting fractures. The God delusion. Montezuma, Cortés, and Quetzalcoatl, one of the most persistent myths is that Moctezuma II, the name is often anglicized, as Montezuma believed Cortés was the returning god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. According to the story, an ancient prophecy foretold that Quetzalcoatl would return from the east in the year 1 Reed, which corresponded to 1519, to reclaim his kingdom. Moctezuma, paralyzed by religious terror, sent lavish gifts to Cortés and welcomed him into Tenochtitlan, effectively handing over his empire. This is romantic nonsense, invented by Spanish chroniclers years after the fact to justify their conquest as divine will. First, there is no pre-conquest Aztec prophecy about Quetzalcoatl returning to overthrow the Mexica. The prophecy appears only in Spanish sources written after the conquest. The Mexica had many myths about Quetzalcoatl, but none described a vengeful return from across the sea. The identification of Cortés with the god was a post hoc interpretation cooked up by Franciscan friars who wanted to see their mission as the triumph of Christianity over native paganism. Second, Moctezuma's actions make perfect sense if you abandon the god myth. From the moment the Spanish expedition landed on the Gulf Coast in April 1519, Moctezuma sent spies and gifts. But the gifts, gold, jade, fine featherwork, were not tributes to a deity. They were classic diplomatic offerings designed to do one thing: convince the strangers to take the gold and go away. In Mesoamerican political culture, giving expensive gifts to a foreign power was a way to honor them and simultaneously place them under obligation to leave. It was not submission, it was bribery. When the gifts failed to deter the Spaniards, Cortés, after all, was an outlaw from Cuba on a desperate bid for glory, Moctezuma tried other strategies. He sent magicians and priests to cast spells on the Spanish. He attempted to ambush them at the pass of the Sierra de Puebla, only to see his warriors flee in confusion at the sight of Spanish horses. More on that later. He even ordered the coastal governor, a noble named Qualpopoca, to attack the Spanish garrison at Veracruz. This attack succeeded in killing several Spaniards, which is why Cortés later used it as a pretext to seize Moctezuma. In short, Moctezuma was not a superstitious coward. He was a seasoned ruler who used every tool in his diplomatic and military arsenal. His problem was not religious delusion. His problem was that he could not find a single strategy that worked against these bizarre, relentless newcomers. And his biggest miscalculation came when he decided to let them enter Tenochtitlan. Why did he do that? Not because he worshipped them, because he wanted to trap them inside his own capital, where his overwhelming numbers could destroy them at a moment of his choosing. In theory, it was a brilliant move. In practice, it backfired catastrophically. The Tlaxcalan Alliance, the real conquerors. Let's get one thing straight. Hernán Cortés did not conquer the Aztec Empire. The Tlaxcalans did. Tlaxcala was a small, fiercely independent republic in the mountains east of the Valley of Mexico. For decades, the Mexica had tried to conquer them and failed. The Tlaxcalans had no love for Tenochtitlan. In fact, they had perfected a form of warfare that prioritized capturing Mexico warriors for sacrifice. A mirror image of the Aztec way. When Cortés arrived on their border in September 1519, the Tlaxcalans did what they always did to strangers. They attacked. For 2 weeks, the Spaniards fought a series of brutal skirmishes against Tlaxcalan armies. And here's the first great surprise of the real history. The Spaniards almost lost, repeatedly. According to Cortés's own letters, the Tlaxcalan warriors fought with a ferocity and tactical skill that terrified his men. Spanish crossbows and cannons inflicted casualties, but the Tlaxcalans adapted quickly, avoiding open formations and fighting in the broken mountain terrain. At one point, the Spaniards were surrounded, their ammunition nearly gone, and Cortés reportedly told his men to prepare to die. Why did the Tlaxcalans not finish them off? Because their leaders realized something. These strange, pale-skinned men with their terrifying animals and metal weapons could be useful. The Tlaxcalans had been fighting a defensive war of attrition against the Mexica for generations. They had never been able to break the Triple Alliance alone, but these newcomers who came from the east, who had already fought Mexica garrisons, who rode beasts never seen in Mexico, might be the battering ram they needed. So the Tlaxcalans did something that would shock any European observer. They made peace with Cortés. They offered him thousands of warriors, food, and safe passage through their lands. In return, they asked for nothing but the chance to finally destroy Tenochtitlan. This alliance changed everything. From October 1519 onward, the so-called Spanish force was overwhelmingly indigenous. When Cortés marched on Tenochtitlan in November 1519, he had perhaps 350 Spaniards and more than 3,000 Tlaxcalan warriors. When he fled the city in the catastrophic Noche Triste, sad night of June 1520, his Spanish casualties were severe, but his Tlaxcalan allies were slaughtered by the thousands. When he laid siege to Tenochtitlan in 1521, his army consisted of fewer than 900 Spaniards and at least 80,000. Some sources say 150,000. Tlaxcalan, Texcocan, and other native warriors. The siege of Tenochtitlan was not a European conquest. It was a massive indigenous civil war, with a tiny Spanish paramilitary force acting as the spearhead. Cortés himself acknowledged this, though later Spanish accounts tried to bury it. In his letters to King Charles V, he repeatedly praises the Tlaxcalans as loyal friends and the most valiant people he has ever seen. Without them, he writes, he could never have taken Tenochtitlan. That is the quiet truth. Cortés was not a conqueror. He was a junior partner in a native revolution, the Noche Triste. When the Aztecs almost won, if the Tlaxcalan alliance was the strategic key, The Noche Triste was the moment when the entire enterprise nearly collapsed, and it shows just how close the Aztecs came to annihilating the Spanish. The sequence of events is often glossed over. Cortés entered Tenochtitlan in November 1519 as a guest. Moctezuma housed him and his men in the palace of Axayacatl, right in the heart of the city. For 6 months, an uneasy standoff prevailed. Cortés was a prisoner in a golden cage. Moctezuma was a hostage in his own palace, forced to swear loyalty to the Spanish king. Then news arrived from the coast. A larger Spanish expedition under Panfilo de Narvaez had landed to arrest Cortés for insubordination. Cortés rushed back to the coast, defeated Narvaez, and incorporated his men into his own force. But while Cortés was away, his deputy in Tenochtitlan, Pedro de Alvarado, committed an act of staggering brutality. It was May 1520, the month of the festival of Tezcatl, the most sacred ceremony honoring the god Huitzilopochtli. The Mexican nobility gathered in the main temple courtyard to dance and sing. Alvarado, fearing an uprising, ordered his men to attack the unarmed celebrants. They slaughtered hundreds, possibly thousands, in what became known as the Massacre of the Great Temple. Even Bernal Diaz, no friend of the Aztecs, wrote that it was a very cruel act. The massacre ended the pretense of peace. The Mexica rose in fury. They attacked the Spanish compound, cut off the aqueducts, and drove the Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies into a desperate defensive pocket. Moctezuma, the captive emperor, was brought onto the roof to calm his people. They responded with stones and arrows, mortally wounding him, though it remains unclear whether the Mexica killed him or the Spanish finished him off. Either way, Moctezuma died, and his death removed the last bargaining chip. Cortés, having returned from the coast with reinforcements, found himself trapped in a city that hated him. He decided to escape under cover of night. On the night of June 30th to July 1st, 1520, the Spaniards and their allies loaded their treasure and tried to cross one of the causeways leading out of the island city. The Mexica had anticipated the move. As the column advanced, war canoes swarmed from all sides. The causeway was narrow. Men slipped into the water, drowning under the weight of their armor. The Tlaxcalans, who lacked armor, fought like demons but were cut down in droves. The Spanish rear guard was annihilated. By dawn, the survivors limped onto the mainland. Of perhaps 1,300 Spaniards, including Narvaez's men and several thousand Tlaxcalans, more than 2/3 were dead. Every single cannon was lost. Most of the horses were killed. The treasure, the gold that had been the entire point of the expedition, lay at the bottom of the lake. The Noche Triste was an Aztec military victory, a crushing one. If the Mexica had pursued the fleeing survivors, they could have finished the war in a single morning. But the Mexica had no tradition of pursuit after a rout. Their warfare focused on capturing victims for sacrifice, not total annihilation. They also believed that the gods would finish the Spanish off in the mountains. They were wrong. Cortés and his battered force crawled back to Tlaxcala, expecting to be betrayed or sacrificed. Instead, the Tlaxcalans embraced them. Why? Because the Tlaxcalans understood that the Spanish were now more useful than ever. The Mexica had proven that they could be beaten in a set-piece night battle, but they had not broken the Spanish spirit. The Tlaxcalan Senate calculated coldly. With Spanish steel and horses, they could finally do what they had dreamed of for decades: march on Tenochtitlan and wipe it from the earth. So instead of killing Cortés, they fed him, rearmed him, and began planning the siege. The Aztecs had won the battle, but they had lost the war because their enemies refused to accept defeat. The unseen conqueror, smallpox. Now we come to the factor that is almost never mentioned in popular accounts, yet it is the single most important reason for the fall of the Aztec Empire. It was not horses, guns, or even Tlaxcalan steel. It was a virus. Smallpox arrived in Mexico in late 1520. It came not with Cortés's original expedition, but with a slave from a Spanish ship that had reached the coast. The disease spread like a forest fire through a population with zero immunity. It killed indiscriminately. Young and old, rich and poor, warrior and peasant. It caused high fevers, pustules, internal bleeding, and death within a week. The mortality rate among the Mexica was astronomical. Estimates range from 40% to 50% of the entire population of central Mexico. Here is the chilling detail. Smallpox reached Tenochtitlan before Cortés did. When the Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies returned to the Valley of Mexico in December 1520, they found a world transformed. The new Aztec Emperor, Cuitlahuac, had died of the disease after only 80 days on the throne. The armies that had routed the Spanish on the Noche were decimated. Commanders were dead. The harvest had been neglected because the sick could not farm. The living were too weak to bury the dead, and the stench of rotting bodies filled the city. The disease did not spare the Spanish, but the Spanish had been exposed to smallpox in childhood. Most had immunity. They suffered very few losses. The Tlaxcalans, like the Mexica, had no immunity. They too died in appalling numbers. But the Tlaxcalans had one advantage. They were fighting on the offensive, and they could draw reinforcements from a population that had not yet been infected. The Mexica, trapped in a besieged island city, had no such luxury. Modern historians like William H. McNeill and Jared Diamond have argued convincingly that smallpox was the decisive weapon. Without it, the Tlaxcalan-Spanish alliance would have faced a Mexica army of perhaps 200,000 warriors, still well supplied and led by experienced commanders. Even with indigenous allies, Cortés would have been crushed. With it, the Mexica were a dying people fighting a desperate last stand against enemies who could barely believe their luck. The Spanish themselves did not understand the biological warfare they had unleashed. Some saw it as divine intervention. Friars wrote that God had sent a plague to soften the hearts of the heathen. Others simply thanked their stars. But the epidemiological reality is inescapable. The fall of Tenochtitlan was as much a victory of germs as of men. The siege a war of attrition, not heroism. By the spring of 1521, the stage was set for the final act. Cortés had regrouped in Texcoco, a lakeside city that had defected from the Triple Alliance. He had 13 brigantines, small, purpose-built warships, constructed from lumber carried over the mountains by thousands of Tlaxcalan porters. These ships would allow him to control the lake, cutting off Tenochtitlan's access to food and water. On land, his army surrounded the city. One causeway from the north, one from the south, and one from the west, each guarded by a mix of Spanish and native forces. The eastern side of the city was open water, but the brigantines sealed it. The siege began in earnest on May 30th, 1521. It lasted 93 days, and it was one of the most brutal military operations ever recorded in the Americas. Contrary to the heroic imagery, there were few grand charges or knightly duels. Instead, the battle was a grinding, day-by-day advance across the causeways, each paved with the bodies of dead warriors. The Mexica fought with a ferocity born of despair. They had no chance of breaking the siege. Their only hope was to inflict so many casualties that the Allies would give up. They threw spears, hurled stones, shot arrows from canoes, and even used captured Spanish swords against their former owners. The brigantines proved crucial. They swept the lake clear of Mexica canoes, then bombarded the city with small cannons. But the real damage was done by the blockade. Tenochtitlan had no source of fresh water except an aqueduct from the mainland. The Spanish cut that on the first day. Food supplies dwindled. The Mexica ate roots, bark, lizards, and finally, according to some sources, the flesh of the dead. Smallpox, dysentery, and starvation killed far more people than Spanish steel. The defenders made several desperate counterattacks. One, led by the new emperor Cuauhtémoc, almost broke through the Spanish lines on the western causeway. Cortés himself was captured and nearly sacrificed. Only a last-minute rescue by his bodyguards saved him. Another attack destroyed several brigantines, but each victory bought only a day. The noose kept tightening. By August, Tenochtitlan was a skeletal ruin. The canals were clogged with bodies. The magnificent temples were used as fortresses, their steps slick with blood. The Spanish and Tlaxcalans advanced house by house, flattening the city behind them. Cortés ordered his men to fill in canals with rubble to allow cavalry to operate, a tactic that destroyed the city's infrastructure permanently. On August 13th, 1521, Cuauhtémoc tried to flee across the lake in a canoe. He was captured by a Spanish brigantine. When he was brought before Cortés, the emperor reportedly asked only to be killed. Cortés, ever the pragmatist, refused. He kept Cuauhtémoc alive for 3 years, then had him executed on trumped-up charges of conspiracy. With the emperor in chains, the remaining Mexica laid down their arms. The siege was over. Tenochtitlan had fallen. But what had fallen was not an empire in the prime of its power. It was a starving, plague-ridden, burned-out husk of a city, defended by warriors who had lost half their number to disease before the first Spanish cannon was fired. The aftermath. A conquest that wasn't. If the fall of Tenochtitlan was not a European conquest, what was it? The answer is complex and uncomfortable. In the short term, the Spanish reaped the rewards. They looted the city, what little was left, and divided the gold, though many of the conquistadors were bitterly disappointed by the meager spoils. Cortés was appointed governor and captain general of New Spain. He began the process of building Mexico City on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, using the same stones and the same forced indigenous labor. But the conquest of the rest of Mexico took decades, not years. The Spanish did not simply march in and take over. They had to negotiate with hundreds of native city-states, each with its own agenda. The Tlaxcalans, far from being subjugated, were given special privileges. They retained their own rulers, paid no tribute for decades, and were allowed to ride horses and carry swords, rights denied to other natives. In effect, the Tlaxcalans became a colonial elite, collaborating with the Spanish against their traditional enemies. Other city-states quickly learned the new rules. They swore loyalty to the Spanish king, accepted Catholic missionaries, and in return were left to govern their own affairs as long as they paid tribute. The Spanish called this system indirect rule, or more cynically, encomienda, a grant of native labor to a Spanish overlord. But underneath the Spanish language, the old Mesoamerican political structure survived. Kings Tlatoani continued to rule their Altepetl. Native armies were used to conquer other native peoples, especially the farther north and west the Spanish pushed. The real break came not in 1521, but in the decades after, as waves of Spanish settlers arrived, as diseases continued to sweep through native populations, and as the Catholic Church systematically dismantled indigenous religious practices. The fall of Tenochtitlan was the beginning of the end, not the end itself. And it was not a straightforward story of European triumph. It was a messy, contingent, and deeply tragic process in which native actors made choices, alliances, betrayals, resistance, that shaped the outcome as much as any Spanish sword, the myths we still believe, and why they matter. Given the enormous gap between the popular story and the historical reality, we must ask, why does the myth persist? Part of the answer lies in the sources that became canonical. The Spanish chroniclers, especially Francisco López de Gomara, created a heroic narrative that served the interests of the Spanish crown. It depicted the conquest as a righteous mission, a triumph of civilization over barbarism, of Christianity over human sacrifice. This narrative justified colonial rule. To admit that the Spanish were little more than opportunistic allies of indigenous rebels, that the Aztec Empire collapsed from within, with a little help from a virus, would have undermined the entire ideological foundation of New Spain. The indigenous chronicles, like the Florentine Codex, told a different story. They emphasized the horror, the tragedy, and the inexplicable nature of the defeat. But even these texts were shaped by Spanish censorship. Sahagún's informants, writing decades after the fall, had internalized the idea that the Spanish were destined to win. They recorded the signs and omens that supposedly predicted the disaster. A comet, a temple that burned without cause, a woman wailing in the night. These were not pre-conquest beliefs, but post-conquest attempts to make sense of an incomprehensible catastrophe. They became the raw material of the Quetzalcoatl myth. Then there's the role of popular media. From William H. Prescott's 1843 classic, History of the Conquest of Mexico, to modern video games and TV series, the story has been streamlined. Horses are dramatic, smallpox is not. A god king is poetic. A complex tribute network is boring. The Hollywood version, brave Spaniards, savage Aztecs, a beautiful native translator Lama Lynch, torn between two worlds, sells tickets. The real version, indigenous civil war, biological holocaust, political calculation, is too messy and too dark for easy consumption. But the myth matters beyond historical accuracy. It shapes how we think about power, resistance, and blame. The myth of the conquistador hero justifies colonial violence as heroic. The myth of the superstitious Aztec justifies the erasure of native agency. And the myth of the gift of civilization erases the millions of indigenous people who died in the century after 1521, not just from disease, but from overwork, starvation, and deliberate cruelty. Reclaiming the true story is an act of historical justice. It does not mean celebrating the Aztecs. Their practice of mass human sacrifice was real and by modern standards monstrous. But it does mean acknowledging that they were not passive victims of history. They made choices. They fought back. They almost won. And they lost not to a handful of European adventurers, but to a perfect storm of disease, internal division, and the cold calculus of indigenous political rivals who saw an opportunity and took it. A different kind of lesson. So, what was the fall of the Aztec Empire really like? It was nothing like you were told. It was a war of native liberation fought mostly by native hands. It was a biological apocalypse that killed more people than any battle. It was a siege of horrifying attrition, not a climactic cavalry charge. It was a story of brilliant diplomacy, the Tlaxcalans, catastrophic miscalculation, Moctezuma, unspeakable cruelty, Alvarado's massacre, and dumb luck, smallpox, arriving when it did. And it was, above all, a tragedy, not in the Greek sense of a hero's flaw, but in the modern sense of thousands of ordinary people dying of thirst on a causeway while their city burned behind them. The next time you hear someone say that Cortés conquered the Aztecs with 500 men, you can correct them, and then you can tell them the real story, the story of the Tlaxcalan Republic that saw its chance, the story of the Mexica warriors who fought to the last drop of blood, the story of the invisible enemy that left the living to bury the dead, and the story of how a tiny band of Spanish outcasts stumbled into a war they did not start and nearly lost. That story is longer, sadder, and infinitely more human than the myth, and it is the only one worth remembering.